The moment Beatrice Calloway stepped onto the fire escape outside her cramped studio apartment, she knew she was about to do something monumentally stupid. 8 stories up, the metal grating swayed slightly beneath her feet as she clutched the railing with white knuckles, staring at the charcoal gray kitten perched precariously on the ledge of the adjacent building. The gap between structures was maybe 3 feet, but it looked like the Grand Canyon from where she stood. "Please don't move," she whispered to the terrified animal, whose green eyes reflected the late afternoon sun. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen from 7B, had been crying in the hallway for 20 minutes about her missing cat, and Beatrice had impulsively volunteered to help search. Now here she was, contemplating the kind of leap that would make her late mother roll over in her grave. Beatrice had always been the cautious one. While her younger sister Emma backpacked through Southeast Asia with nothing but a credit card and a prayer, Beatrice had stayed in Portland, working as a pastry chef at a modest French bakery, paying her bills on time, never taking unnecessary risks. Her entire life had been constructed around the principle of safety first, dreams second. The kitten mewed pitifully. "I'm not brave enough," she said aloud, her voice barely audible over the traffic noise below. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The logical part of her brain screamed to call the fire department, to wait for professionals. But the kitten was moving closer to the edge, and Mrs. Chen's tear-streaked face flashed through her mind. "Then let me be brave enough for both of us." The voice came from above, deep and assured, and Beatrice jerked her head up so fast she nearly lost her balance. A man stood on the fire escape 1 floor up, already swinging his leg over the railing. He moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd done dangerous things before and lived to tell about it. Dark hair, broad shoulders, a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked completely out of place on a rusty fire escape in this working-class neighborhood. "Wait, what are you doing?" Beatrice called up, but he was already descending the ladder with practiced ease. "Same thing you were about to do, except I'm about 6 inches taller and have longer reach," he said, landing beside her with a soft thud that made the entire structure rattle. Up close, she could see his eyes were a striking shade of amber, and there was a small scar above his left eyebrow that somehow made him more handsome rather than less. "Owen Fitzgerald. I just moved into 9C. Beatrice Calloway, 8D. She felt absurdly formal given the circumstances. "But seriously, you don't have to. I know I don't have to." He was already assessing the gap, the angle, the stability of both fire escapes. "But I'm going to. Hold this." He shrugged off his watch, an expensive-looking piece that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and handed it to her. The metal was warm from his skin. Before she could protest further, Owen gripped the railing, tested his weight, and in one fluid motion, launched himself across the gap. Beatrice's breath caught in her throat as he landed solidly on the opposite fire escape, the metal groaning but holding. He made it look easy, like stepping over a puddle rather than a potentially fatal drop. The kitten hissed as he approached, but Owen moved slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Beatrice couldn't hear the words, but she could see the effect. Within seconds, he had the small animal cradled against his chest, one hand supporting its body while the other stroked behind its ears. "Okay, little one, let's get you home," he murmured, and then looked back at Beatrice across the divide. "I'm going to hand him to you. Can you reach?" Beatrice's common sense warred with the immediate need. "That's too far, you'll have to jump back." "Not with a cat in my hands. Could drop him." Owen was already leaning over the railing, extending his arms as far as they would go. "Come on, Beatrice Calloway from 8D, be brave with me." Something about the way he said her name, like it mattered, like she mattered, made her move forward. She stretched across the gap, her stomach pressed against the cold metal railing, arms extended until her shoulders screamed in protest. The distance was still too great. "A little more," Owen encouraged. "I've got you. I won't let you fall." It was a ridiculous promise from a man she'd met 2 minutes ago, but Beatrice believed him. She leaned further, her toes barely touching the grating, and then his fingers were brushing hers, and the warm, furry weight of the kitten was being transferred into her arms. She pulled back quickly, clutching the animal to her chest, her heart racing from adrenaline and something else she couldn't quite name. Owen vaulted back across the gap with the same easy grace, landing beside her with a grin that transformed his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely devastating. "See, brave enough for both of us." The kitten chose that moment to dig its claws into Beatrice's shoulder, making her yelp. Owen reached over, gently detaching the tiny hooks from her sweater, his fingers brushing against her collarbone in a way that sent electricity skittering across her skin. "Sorry," he said, though he didn't look particularly sorry. "Cats, they show gratitude in weird ways, Mrs." Chen's overwhelming relief and gratitude came in the form of homemade dumplings delivered to both their apartments that evening. Beatrice was arranging them on a plate, still wearing her flour-dusted work clothes from the bakery, when there was a knock at her door. Owen stood in the hallway, holding his own container of dumplings, looking somehow more intimidating in casual jeans and a navy sweater than he had in dress clothes. "I was thinking," he said without preamble, "that someone who almost jumped between buildings to save a cat probably doesn't do that sort of thing every day." "First time, actually," Beatrice admitted, stepping aside to let him in. Her apartment was tiny, the kitchen visible from the front door, her bed tucked into an alcove that barely qualified as a separate bedroom. She watched him take it all in without judgment, just curiosity. "First time for me with the cat rescue," he said. "But not the first time I've told someone I'd be brave enough for both of us." "Does that line usually work?" His laugh was warm and genuine. "It's not a line, it's more of a life philosophy." He set his dumplings on her small counter. "I grew up watching my mother be afraid of everything. Afraid to leave my father even though he was terrible to her. Afraid to pursue her dreams. Afraid to take any risk that might lead to happiness. When she finally died, all I could think was that she'd never really lived." The sudden intimacy of the confession made Beatrice's chest tighten. "I'm sorry. Don't be. It taught me something important." Owen's amber eyes found hers. "That fear is the only thing that can truly trap us. Everything else is just circumstance." Beatrice thought about her own fears, the carefully constructed walls around her life, the dreams she'd filed away under "someday" and "maybe." "That's a nice philosophy for someone who seems to have their life together," she said, gesturing at his expensive watch, which she'd returned on the fire escape. "Some of us have to be cautious because we can't afford mistakes. You think I have my life together?" Owen's expression turned wry. "Beatrice, I just moved into a building that doesn't even have a working elevator because I needed to get away from everything I've known for the past 10 years. I'm as lost as anyone." They ate dumplings standing at her kitchen counter because her apartment only had one chair, and Owen insisted she take it while he leaned against the refrigerator. He told her about his recent move to Portland, though he was vague about the reasons. She told him about the bakery, about her passion for creating intricate pastries that were small, edible works of art. "You should open your own place," Owen said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Right, with what money?" Beatrice laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Do you know what commercial real estate costs in this city? Not to mention equipment, permits, staffing, so you've looked into it." She had. She'd done more than look into it. Beatrice had a business plan sitting in a folder on her laptop, complete with financial projections, marketing strategies, and a list of potential locations she'd driven past 100 times. Doesn't matter. I'd need at least $300,000 to start, and I have about $15,000 in savings. The math doesn't work. Math can change, Owen said simply, and something about his tone made her think he knew more about money than his modest new apartment suggested. Over the following weeks, Beatrice found herself spending more time with Owen than she'd spent with anyone in years. He had a way of showing up exactly when she needed someone, whether it was helping her carry groceries up 8 flights when the elevator was broken, or appearing at the bakery right before closing with coffee and an eagerness to hear about her day. She learned that he woke up early, often before dawn, and went running through the neighborhood regardless of weather. She learned that he was unfailingly polite to everyone, from Mrs. Chen to the surly teenager who delivered their mail. She learned that he had a scar on his left side from a motorcycle accident when he was 22, and that he'd grown up in San Francisco, but had lived all over the country. What she didn't learn was what he actually did for a living. Whenever she asked, Owen would smile and change the subject so smoothly she barely noticed until later. It should have been a red flag, but everything else about him was so genuine that she let it slide. "Come somewhere with me," Owen said one Saturday morning, appearing at her door with 2 travel mugs of coffee and an expression that suggested he wouldn't take no for an answer. "I have to work this afternoon," Beatrice protested, but she was already reaching for her jacket. "I'll have you back by noon." He drove a surprisingly modest sedan, though Beatrice noticed it was immaculately maintained and had that new car smell despite being at least a few years old. They headed out of the city, into the hills where the houses grew larger and the trees thicker. Beatrice was about to ask where they were going when Owen pulled off onto a narrow private road that wound up through pine forests. The house at the end of the road was stunning, all glass and natural wood, perched on the hillside with views that stretched for miles. Owen parked and killed the engine, staring at the building with an expression Beatrice couldn't quite read. "Is this your place?" she asked, confused. Why would he be living in a cramped apartment building if he owned something like this? It was supposed to be. Owen's voice was tight. "I bought the land 5 years ago. Spent 3 years designing it, another year building it. Moved in last spring with my fiancée, Melissa. We were supposed to get married here, have kids here, grow old here." He paused, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. "Then I found out she'd been having an affair with my business partner for 2 years. They're married now, living in the condo we used to share downtown. Owen, I'm so sorry." Beatrice's heart ached for him. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because I need to sell it, and I can't seem to make myself do it alone." He finally looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly undid her. "I thought maybe if I brought someone who understands fear, who knows what it's like to let it control you, I could finally be brave enough to let it go." They walked through the house together, and despite the painful circumstances, Beatrice couldn't help but fall in love with it. The kitchen had everything she'd ever dreamed of: professional-grade appliances, miles of counter space, windows that let in gorgeous natural light. The master bedroom had a fireplace and a balcony overlooking the valley. There was an office, a library, even a small workshop. "This is the kind of place people dream about their entire lives," Beatrice said, running her hand along the smooth wood of the kitchen island. "You really want to sell it?" "I don't want to live in a monument to my failure." Owen stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by empty space and too many memories. "Every room reminds me of plans that didn't happen, a future that evaporated." "Or," Beatrice said carefully. Every room could be a blank slate, new plans, different future. Owen looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "You're right," he said softly. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." On the drive back to the city, Owen was quieter than usual, his mood pensive. Beatrice wanted to ask what he was thinking but sensed he needed space to process. It wasn't until they pulled up outside their building that he spoke again. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," Owen said, cutting the engine but making no move to get out of the car. "About who I am, what I do." Beatrice's stomach tightened with anxiety. Here it came, the revelation that would ruin everything. He was married. He was a criminal. He was leaving Portland. Her mind spiraled through possibilities, each worse than the last. "I'm not just some guy who moved here to start over," Owen continued. "My full name is Owen Fitzgerald, and I founded Fitzgerald Development 3 years ago. We do commercial real estate, mostly mixed-use buildings in mid-sized cities. Last year we were valued at about $80 million. Beatrice stared at him, trying to process this information. "You're a millionaire." "Several times over, yes." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as nervousness. "I didn't tell you because people treat me differently when they know. They want things, or they assume things, or they get weird about paying for coffee. But you should know, because I can't keep pretending I'm just a regular guy who happened to move into your building." "Why did you move into our building?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "Surely you could afford somewhere nicer. Somewhere with a working elevator and water pressure that doesn't drop to nothing every time someone flushes." Owen's jaw tightened. "Because after Melissa, after the betrayal, I needed to know if anyone could care about me without knowing about the money. I needed to be just Owen for a while. Anonymous, normal." He turned to face her fully. "And then I met you. And you were brave enough to risk your life for a stranger's cat, and cautious enough to think through every angle before making a decision, and talented enough to create beauty every single day, even though you're not getting the recognition you deserve. I kept meaning to tell you, but I was terrified you'd look at me the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Like I've been lying to you? Like I'm not the person you thought I was?" Beatrice closed her eyes, trying to untangle her emotions. Was she angry? Yes. Hurt? Definitely. But underneath those feelings was something else, something that felt uncomfortably like relief. Because Owen being wealthy didn't change the fundamental fact that he'd jumped across a fire escape to save a cat, or that he'd shown up with coffee on her worst days, or that he'd shared his most painful memories in a glass house full of ghosts. "I need time to think about this," she said finally, opening her car door. "Thank you for being honest, even if it took you a while to get there." She didn't wait for his response, just headed into the building and climbed all 8 flights because the elevator was broken again, and because she needed the physical exertion to match the churning in her mind. For 3 days, Beatrice avoided Owen. She left for work early and came home late. When she heard his footsteps in the hallway, she stayed quiet until he passed. It was childish, she knew, but she needed space to figure out what she felt, what she wanted, what this all meant. The problem was that avoiding Owen meant noticing his absence. Her mornings felt empty without his random check-ins. Her evenings stretched longer without the possibility of him knocking on her door. Even Mrs. Chen noticed, commenting that she hadn't seen Beatrice's handsome friend lately. On the 4th day, Emma called. Beatrice's sister had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, even from 3,000 miles away where she was currently working as a surf instructor in Costa Rica. "Spill," Emma demanded without preamble. "You sound weird." "I don't sound like anything. You can't hear my face." "I can hear your tone, and your tone is weird." What happened? Beatrice found herself spilling the entire story, from the kitten rescue to the glass house to Owen's revelation about his wealth. Emma listened without interrupting, which was unusual enough that Beatrice knew this was serious. "Okay, let me get this straight," Emma said when she'd finished. "This gorgeous, kind, wealthy man has been pursuing you, respecting your boundaries, sharing his deepest traumas and generally being perfect. And you're upset because he didn't immediately tell you he was rich. He lied to me. He protected himself. There's a difference." Emma's voice softened. "B, you've spent your entire life being cautious. You never studied abroad with me because it seemed risky. You didn't go to culinary school in Paris even though you got accepted because you were afraid to take out loans. You won't even try online dating because what if you meet a serial killer? When are you going to let yourself take a chance on something good? What if it doesn't work out? What if I get hurt? What if it does work out? What if you don't?" Emma countered. "You can't live your whole life afraid, B. That's not living. That's just existing." After she hung up, Beatrice sat in her apartment for a long time, staring at the folder on her laptop labeled Bakery Dreams. She'd created it 3 years ago and updated it periodically, but she'd never done anything with it. Never applied for a loan, never looked for investors, never taken any concrete steps toward making it real. Because she was afraid of failure, afraid of success. Afraid of wanting something so badly that losing it would break her. She thought about Owen saying he'd be brave enough for both of them. At the time, she'd thought it was sweet but unrealistic. Now she wondered if maybe that was how bravery worked. Not as a solo endeavor, but as something you could share, could build together, could borrow from someone else when your own ran out. Beatrice opened her door before she could second-guess the decision, walked down the hall to 9C, and knocked before her courage failed. Owen answered so quickly she suspected he'd been standing nearby. He looked terrible, his hair uncombed, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The sight of him so undone because of her made something crack open in her chest. "I'm not brave enough," she said, echoing her words from the fire escape. "I've never been brave enough. I don't take risks. I don't make leaps. I plan and I prepare and I protect myself from every possible disappointment." "Beatrice," Owen started, but she held up a hand. "But I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of dreaming small because it feels safer. I'm tired of pushing away good things because they might turn into bad things." She took a deep breath. "You should have told me about the money sooner. That's true. But I understand why you didn't, and I forgive you, and I'd really like to stop avoiding you because it turns out I miss you constantly when I do." Owen's expression transformed, hope and relief and something deeper flooding his features. "I miss you too, every second of every day." "I don't know how to do this," Beatrice admitted. "I don't know how to date someone wealthy or successful or confident. I don't know how to be the kind of person who belongs in a glass house on a hill." "Good thing you don't have to be." Owen stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. "I don't want someone who belongs in that house. I want someone who can make it feel like a home, someone who's brave enough to try, even when she's scared, someone exactly like you." "That's a lot of pressure. Then let me carry it with you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Let me be brave enough for both of us until you're ready to meet me halfway." Beatrice leaned into his touch, making her choice. "Okay." The kiss started gentle, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But then Beatrice's hands found their way to Owen's hair, and his arms wrapped around her waist, and the gentleness gave way to urgency, to weeks of suppressed wanting, to the recognition that this was right in a way neither of them had expected. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen pressed his forehead to hers. For the record, I'm completely in love with you. Have been since you tried to reason with a cat while standing on a death trap of a fire escape." Beatrice laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "That's absurd. You didn't even know me." "I knew enough." Owen pulled back just enough to see her face. "I knew you were someone who'd risk herself for others. Someone who creates beautiful things with her hands. Someone who dreams bigger than she admits but won't let herself reach for those dreams." His thumb traced her jawline. "I knew I wanted to be the person who helped you reach." "I'm not in love with you yet," Beatrice said honestly, because she'd spent too long hiding her truth to start lying now. "But I think I could be, very easily, possibly soon. I can work with possibly soon." Owen's smile was radiant. "How about we start with dinner? Actual dinner at a restaurant, like a real date." They went to a small Italian place in the Pearl District, the kind of restaurant with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles and a grandmother cooking in the back. Owen had made reservations somewhere fancy, but Beatrice had asked for something more intimate, less showy, and he'd immediately changed plans without complaint. Over pasta and red wine, Owen told her more about Fitzgerald development, about how he'd started with a single investment property and grown it into a small empire, about the 80-hour weeks and the constant pressure and the satisfaction of creating something from nothing, about how the betrayal with Melissa had made him question everything he'd built, wonder if success meant anything without someone to share it with. Beatrice told him about her childhood, about growing up with a mother who saw danger everywhere and a father who died young in a car accident, confirming all his wife's worst fears. About Emma's rebellion against that fear and Beatrice's own internalization of it. About the bakery, about Margaret, her boss who was kind but limited in vision, who saw pastries as product rather than art. "Show me your business plan," Owen said over tiramisu that wasn't nearly as good as what Beatrice could make. "The one for your bakery." "You don't want to read my amateur business plan. I build businesses for a living. I absolutely want to rate it." When she hesitated, he added, "Not to criticize, to understand, to see what you see when you imagine your future." So Beatrice brought her laptop the next evening to Owen's apartment, which turned out to be much nicer than she'd expected given the building. He'd furnished it minimally but well, and the space felt lived in rather than temporary. They sat on his couch, her laptop between them, and she watched his face as he read through her careful projections and market analysis. "This is really good," Owen said after a long silence. "Your numbers are conservative but realistic. Your marketing strategy is smart. Your concept is unique enough to stand out but accessible enough to build a customer base." "But," Beatrice prompted, hearing the unspoken word, "but you're thinking too small." Owen turned the laptop toward her, pointing at her projected revenue. "You've got this as a single location, modest capacity. What if you thought bigger? What if you imagined not just a bakery but a destination, a place people plan visits around, not just stop by on their way to work?" "That would require significantly more capital." "It would require about $450,000 by my calculations." Owen was already making notes on a separate document. "Which is more than you have but less than you think. There are investors who jump at a concept like this, especially with your talent backing it up." Beatrice's heart was racing, caught between hope and terror. "I can't ask you to invest in me. That would be weird, right? Dating someone who's financially invested in your business. I'm not offering to invest." Owen closed the laptop, giving her his full attention. "I'm offering to help you find investors, to introduce you to people I know who fund projects like this, to advise you on the business side while you focus on the creative side." He paused. "Unless you don't want my help, which would be completely valid." "It's not that I don't want it." Beatrice struggled to articulate the tangle of feelings in her chest. It's that I'm afraid of failing and disappointing you, of taking your help and then proving I wasn't worth the investment of time or energy or belief. Owen was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he stood, held out his hand and said, "Come with me." He led her up to the roof of the building, a space most residents avoided because it was cluttered with old furniture and pigeon droppings. But the view was spectacular, the entire city spread out below them, lights twinkling in the dusk. Owen found a relatively clean spot and sat down, pulling Beatrice beside him. When I started Fitzgerald Development, I had about $30,000, a used laptop, and absolutely no idea what I was doing, he said. My first property was a condemned building in Oakland that everyone said was unsalvageable. I spent 6 months living in a trailer on site, working 16-hour days, learning plumbing and electrical and carpentry from YouTube videos. There were days I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But you didn't. But I almost did. Because halfway through the renovation, I discovered the foundation was worse than the inspection had shown. Fixing it would cost everything I had left and then some. I was 26, exhausted, terrified. I stood in that building and thought about giving up, cutting my losses, getting a normal job with a normal paycheck and normal hours. What stopped you? My mother died when I was 25, about 6 months before I started that first project. At her funeral, the only thing people could say about her was that she was nice. She was kind. She didn't bother anyone. Owen's voice was heavy with old grief. Nobody talked about dreams she'd achieved or risks she'd taken or ways she'd changed the world, because she hadn't done any of those things. She'd been too afraid. And I realized I'd rather fail spectacularly trying to build something than succeed at living small. Beatrice leaned her head on his shoulder, understanding settling over her like a blanket. You think I'm living small. I think you're capable of extraordinary things, and you've convinced yourself that being ordinary is safer. Owen wrapped an arm around her, and maybe it is, but is it better? She didn't have an answer to that, so instead she asked, "What happened with the building?" I took out a predatory loan from a guy who probably had mob connections, fixed the foundation, finished the renovation in 9 months instead of 6. Sold it for 3 times what I paid. Used the profit to buy 2 more properties and never looked back. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. The point is, I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to try anyway, and I'm promising that whether you succeed or fail, I'll be here. Not as an investor, not as someone with a financial stake, but as someone who loves you and believes in you, and knows that your worth has nothing to do with whether a business succeeds. That night, lying in her own bed in her own apartment, Beatrice made a decision. She opened her laptop, updated her business plan with Owen's suggestions, and started compiling a list of potential investors. It was past midnight when she finally sent the document to Owen with a simple message: "Help me be brave enough." His response came immediately, despite the late hour. Always. The next 3 months were a whirlwind. Owen introduced Beatrice to 5 potential investors, all of whom had experience with restaurant and retail ventures. She practiced her pitch until she could deliver it in her sleep, fielding questions about profit margins and expansion potential, and what made her concept different from the dozens of bakeries already in Portland. 3 investors passed. The 4th, a woman named Victoria Chen who'd made her fortune in tech before diversifying into food service, was intrigued but wanted to see Beatrice's work firsthand. Owen arranged for Beatrice to cater a small dinner party at his house, the glass house on the hill that he'd finally decided to keep. Beatrice spent a week planning the menu, testing recipes, adjusting techniques. She wanted to showcase range, from delicate French macarons to rustic Italian biscotti to innovative flavor combinations that hinted at what her bakery could be. Owen stayed out of her way but remained available for taste testing, offering encouragement without input, knowing she needed to own this completely. The night of the dinner party, Beatrice arrived at Owen's house 4 hours early to set up. She'd borrowed equipment from the bakery, transported everything in Owen's sedan, and turned his gorgeous kitchen into her own personal workshop. Owen had invited 8 people, including Victoria and her husband, along with several other business contacts and friends. "You're going to be amazing," Owen said, appearing in the kitchen doorway as Beatrice was arranging her third attempt at the perfect eclair tower. He wore a dark suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine, all broad shoulders and confident posture. "You don't know that," Beatrice muttered, adjusting a pastry that was already perfectly placed. "I do, actually." He crossed the kitchen and turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Because I've watched you work. I've seen the focus and the passion and the artistry. These people would be idiots not to invest, and if they are idiots, we'll find people who aren't. You say that like it's simple. It is simple. Not easy, but simple." Owen pressed a kiss to her forehead. "The complicated part is believing you deserve success. Everything else is just logistics." The dinner party went better than Beatrice had dared hope. Guests raved about every course, from the savory goat cheese and honey tartlets she served as appetizers to the show-stopping croquembouche that served as dessert. Victoria Chen took 3 business cards and made Beatrice promise to send her the updated business plan first thing Monday morning. But the real victory came later, after the guests had left and Beatrice was cleaning up the kitchen with Owen's help. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking unfairly attractive while scrubbing dishes. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from growing ease with each other, and Beatrice realized she was happy. Not anxious about the future, not worried about potential failure, just content in this moment. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words surprising her even as they left her mouth. Owen nearly dropped the plate he was holding. "What? I love you." Beatrice set down the serving platter she'd been drying and turned to face him fully. "I wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was gradual, or maybe it was all at once on that fire escape, and I just needed time to recognize it. But I'm sure now. I'm in love with you, Owen Fitzgerald." The smile that broke across Owen's face was pure joy, unguarded and brilliant. He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, lifted her onto the counter, and kissed her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. Beatrice wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms around his neck, and kissed him back with everything she had, all the words she didn't know how to say translated into touch and taste and need. "I love you too," Owen murmured against her lips between kisses. "In case that wasn't clear. Completely, ridiculously in love with you." They made love in his bed that night, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a view of stars and city lights. Owen was patient and attentive, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch into his touch. Beatrice discovered that confidence looked even better on him without clothes, that his body was as strong as she'd imagined, scarred in places that told stories he'd share later. Afterward, wrapped in expensive sheets with Owen's arm around her waist, Beatrice felt something shift inside her. The fear that had governed her life for so long was still there, probably always would be, but it no longer felt insurmountable. With Owen beside her, she could imagine taking risks. She could imagine failing and surviving it. She could imagine a future bigger than the small, safe life she'd constructed. "Move in with me," Owen said into the darkness, his voice rough with sleepiness. Not because of logistics or convenience, but because I want to wake up next to you every morning. Because I want to come home to you every night. Because this house stopped being haunted the moment you walked into it." Beatrice should have hesitated. Should have listed all the reasons it was too soon, too risky, too much. Instead she said, "Okay, okay, okay, I'll move in with you." She rolled over to face him, needing to see his expression. "On one condition. Anything. You let me turn the workshop into a test kitchen. I want to develop recipes here, try new techniques, maybe even teach small classes eventually." The idea had been forming for weeks, but this was the first time she'd voiced it. "Not right away, but someday, when I'm ready." Owen's smile was tender, his hand coming up to cup her face. "It's yours. The whole house is yours. Make it whatever you want." Victoria Chen called Monday morning at 8 sharp, before Beatrice had even arrived at the bakery. She wanted to invest the full $450,000 for a 30% stake in the business. Beatrice nearly dropped her phone in shock, had to pull over to the side of the road to finish the conversation with her hands shaking and her heart racing. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "There are safer investments, more proven concepts." "Because I've invested in a dozen food service businesses, and most of them fail because the owner doesn't have passion. Just a business idea," Victoria said. "You have both. Plus, any woman who can make my notoriously picky husband eat 3 eclairs in one sitting is someone I want to be in business with." Margaret at the bakery was disappointed to lose Beatrice, but supportive of her plans. She even offered to help during the transition, to teach her whatever she didn't already know about running a commercial kitchen. They settled on a departure date 3 months out, giving Beatrice time to train her replacement and giving Margaret time to adjust. The next 6 months were controlled chaos. Beatrice found the perfect location, a corner property in the Alberta Arts District with huge windows, exposed brick, and enough space for both a retail counter and a small seating area. Owen helped negotiate the lease, using his real estate expertise to ensure she got favorable terms without directly involving his money. She hired an architect to design the layout, worked with contractors on the renovation, spent countless hours selecting equipment and designing the menu, and creating the visual identity for Calloway's confections. Emma flew up from Costa Rica to help with the grand opening, bringing her boundless energy and social media savvy. Through it all, Owen was her constant. He celebrated every victory, from securing the permits to hiring her first employee, a recent culinary school graduate named Sophie, who reminded Beatrice of her younger self. He held her through the inevitable setbacks, the contractor delays and the equipment malfunctions, and the moments when Beatrice was convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. Living together was easier than Beatrice had expected. Owen traveled occasionally for work, but he arranged his schedule to minimize time away. They established routines, like morning coffee on the balcony and evening walks through the neighborhood. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Owen needed silence for the first 20 minutes after waking up, how Beatrice got restless if she didn't create something with her hands at least once a day. They had their first real fight about money, of course. Owen wanted to gift her $50,000 as a buffer, and Beatrice interpreted it as him not believing she could succeed without his help. The argument escalated until they were both saying things they didn't mean, and Beatrice stormed out to sit on the fire escape, finding comfort in the familiar metal grating and dangerous height. Owen found her there an hour later, carefully climbing out to sit beside her in an echo of how they'd met. "I'm sorry," he said without preamble. "You're right. I was being controlling and condescending, and I trust you to build this business without my money. I'm sorry, too." Beatrice leaned against him, her anger already fading. "I know you were trying to help. I just need to do this myself, even if it's harder, especially if it's harder. I know you do. That's one of the things I love most about you." Owen wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "But for the record, when you inevitably succeed and expand to multiple locations, I'm absolutely investing in the next one. Deal?" Calloway's Confections opened on a rainy Tuesday in November, exactly 11 months after Victoria's investment. The line wrapped around the block despite the weather, a mix of curious neighbors and food bloggers and people who'd heard about Beatrice's pastries through word of mouth. Emma managed the social media, posting photos that made everything look even more beautiful than it already was. Sophie handled the register while Beatrice worked the kitchen, producing batch after batch of croissants and tarts and innovative creations that had people coming back the next day. Owen showed up at closing with champagne and flowers, his pride so evident it made Beatrice's chest tight. "You did it," he said, pulling her into his arms despite her flour-covered apron. "You were brave enough." "We did it," Beatrice corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. It just would have taken longer and you would have been more stressed." Owen kissed her, sweet and lingering. "But I'm glad I got to be here for it." The first year of business was brutal in ways Beatrice hadn't anticipated. Long hours, razor-thin margins, constant problem-solving. There were weeks she worked 90 hours, barely saw Owen except in the few hours they slept. But there were also incredible highs, like the 5-star review in the Oregonian, the wedding cake order that led to a dozen more, the regular customer who told her that her croissants were the best she'd had outside of Paris. Owen proposed on the fire escape where they'd met, getting down on one knee on the same rusty grating where he'd first promised to be brave enough for both of them. The ring was a simple platinum band with a single diamond, elegant and understated, exactly what Beatrice would have chosen if she'd chosen for herself. "I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone," Owen said, his amber eyes intense with emotion. "You make me braver. You make me better. You make me want to build a life, not just a business. Marry me, Beatrice. Let me be your partner in everything." "Yes," Beatrice said, laughing through happy tears. "Yes, of course, yes." They were married 6 months later in Owen's backyard, the glass house finally becoming the venue it was meant to be. Emma served as maid of honor, Victoria and Margaret among the guests, along with Sophie and Mrs. Chen and half their apartment building. The ceremony was small and intimate, just 60 people, and Beatrice made her own wedding cake, a 5-tiered masterpiece of vanilla bean and champagne buttercream with hand-painted fondant flowers. "I'm not brave enough to promise I'll never be scared," Beatrice said during her vows, holding Owen's hands and meaning every word. "But I'm brave enough to promise I'll try anyway, to build this life with you, to take risks and face fears and trust that we're stronger together than we ever could be apart. And I promise to be brave enough for both of us whenever you need it," Owen replied, his voice thick with emotion. "To catch you when you fall, to celebrate you when you soar, to love you through every moment in between." Their first year of marriage brought changes neither had anticipated. Calloway's Confections expanded to a second location, this time with Owen as an investor alongside Victoria. Beatrice hired a manager for the original bakery, allowing her to focus on product development and the new location. Owen sold Fitzgerald Development to a larger firm, retaining a consulting role but stepping back from the day-to-day demands that had consumed his 20s. They talked about children, decided to wait another year, then changed their minds when Beatrice discovered she was pregnant 3 months after the wedding. The pregnancy was unplanned but welcome. A daughter they named Claire, who arrived on a snowy February morning with her father's amber eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. Motherhood terrified Beatrice in ways business ownership never had. The stakes were so much higher, the potential for failure so much more devastating. There were nights she stood over Claire's crib, watching her sleep, overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive and happy and healthy. "I'm not brave enough for this," she whispered to Owen one particularly difficult night, when Claire had been crying for hours and nothing Beatrice did seem to help. "What if I mess her up? What if I'm too cautious and make her afraid, or not cautious enough and she gets hurt?" "Then we'll handle it together," Owen said, taking Claire from her arms and somehow getting the baby to settle against his chest. "You're not doing this alone, Beatrice. You never have to do anything alone again." It was a promise he kept in countless small ways, taking the 3 a.m. feedings so Beatrice could sleep, hiring a night nurse when they both were too exhausted to function, building a nursery in what had been the workout room, installing blackout curtains and a rocking chair, and a mobile with handmade pastries that Beatrice had created as a joke, but Owen insisted on hanging. Claire was 6 months old when Beatrice realized she'd stopped being afraid. Not of everything, not all at once, but of the big things. She no longer lay awake catastrophizing about business failure or relationship collapse or all the ways life could go wrong. Because Owen was right, she wasn't alone. They were partners in every sense, sharing responsibilities and joys and the mundane reality of building a life together. On their 2nd anniversary, they returned to the fire escape where everything had started. It had been upgraded since then, the building finally doing necessary repairs, but it still felt like theirs, this space where Beatrice had been brave for the first time in her life. "You remember what you said to me that day?" Owen asked, pulling her close as they watched the sunset paint the city orange and pink. "I said I wasn't brave enough, and I said I'd be brave enough for both of us." Owen turned her to face him, his expression serious. "But I was wrong, Beatrice. You've always been brave. From the moment you stepped onto this fire escape for a stranger's cat, you've been the bravest person I know. You just needed someone to see it, to believe it until you could believe it yourself." Beatrice thought about all the risks she'd taken since that day, starting a business, falling in love, getting married, having a child. Each one had terrified her, and each one had expanded her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. "I think maybe bravery isn't about not being afraid," she said slowly. "It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. And doing it with someone who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself." "I'll always believe in you," Owen promised. "Even when you're 90 and telling me we're too old for adventures. Bold of you to assume I'll ever say that." Beatrice stood on her toes to kiss him, this man who jumped across fire escapes and shared his trauma and helped her build a life bigger than any she dared dream. "Race you upstairs. You're going to wake the baby. Sophie has her for another hour." Beatrice was already climbing back through the window, laughing at Owen's expression. "Come on, Fitzgerald. Be brave enough for both of us." He caught her in the hallway, lifting her against the wall and kissing her breathless, and Beatrice thought about how far she'd come from the cautious woman who'd been too afraid to reach for anything. She'd built a successful business, married an incredible man, become a mother, created a life that was messy and chaotic, and so much better than the safe, small existence she'd once thought was enough. 3 years later, Calloway's Confections had 4 locations across Portland, with plans for expansion into Seattle. Beatrice had been featured in Bon Appetit, won a James Beard Award for Outstanding Baker, and turned down 2 offers from Food Network for her own show, because she preferred teaching occasional classes to performing on camera. Claire was 3, precocious and fearless in the way only toddlers could be, constantly giving her parents heart attacks with her climbing and jumping and absolute lack of concern for physical danger. They just learned Beatrice was pregnant again, a son this time, due in the spring. Owen had started a nonprofit focused on helping low-income entrepreneurs access capital and mentorship, using his own experience and connections to give others the opportunities he'd had to create for himself. He was happier than Beatrice had ever seen him, more at peace with the past and excited about the future. They hosted a party for their 5th wedding anniversary, filling the glass house with friends and family and business associates who'd become like family. Emma was there with her new husband, a marine biologist she'd met in Costa Rica. Victoria and her husband brought their grandchildren. Margaret came with her partner. Mrs. Chen brought dumplings. As Beatrice watched Owen chase Claire around the yard, both of them laughing, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach, she felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. This life, this beautiful, complicated, messy, wonderful life, had started with a moment of fear conquered on a rusty fire escape. "You okay?" Emma appeared beside her, following her gaze. "You've got that look." "What look?" "That disgustingly happy look. It's very unlike you." Emma's tone was teasing, but her smile was genuine. "I'm glad, Bea. You deserve this, all of it." "I don't know about deserve, but I'm grateful for it." Beatrice watched Owen scoop Claire up, the little girl shrieking with delight. "Do you remember when you called me after I met Owen? You said I needed to let myself take a chance on something good." "Vaguely. I give a lot of excellent advice." "You were right. About all of it." Beatrice turned to her sister. "I was so busy being afraid that I nearly missed the best thing that ever happened to me." If he hadn't been brave enough to push, to insist, to promise he'd carry my fear until I was strong enough to carry it myself, I'd still be living in that studio apartment, dreaming small, telling myself I was being practical. But you didn't miss it. That's what matters. Emma hugged her sideways. "And now look at you, business owner, wife, mother, soon-to-be mother of 2, living in a literal glass house like some kind of fairy tale princess." "It's not a fairy tale," Beatrice protested, but without heat, because in some ways it was. Boy meets girl. Boy helps girl save cat. Boy and girl fall in love. Boy and girl build empire together. Boy and girl live happily ever after, except it hadn't been that simple. There had been setbacks and struggles and moments when Beatrice had wanted to give up, to retreat to the safety of the known. There had been fights and miscommunications, and the grinding difficulty of balancing business ownership with marriage and parenthood. There had been failures, both small and large, lessons learned the hard way. But through it all, there had been Owen. Steady and strong and unwaveringly certain that they could handle whatever came. And gradually, Beatrice had become certain too. Not because the fear went away, but because she learned she was bigger than her fear, braver than she'd believed, capable of more than she'd imagined. That night, after the guests had left and Claire was asleep in her room and the house was quiet, Beatrice and Owen stood on the balcony off their bedroom, looking out at the view they'd looked at hundreds of times before. "Thank you," Beatrice said, leaning back against Owen's chest, his arms wrapping around her waist. "For being brave enough when I couldn't be. For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. For jumping across fire escapes and making ridiculous promises and loving me into courage." "You did the hard part," Owen said, his lips against her hair. "I just held space for you to become who you already were, brave and talented and absolutely extraordinary. We make a good team, the best team." Owen's hand moved to rest over hers on her stomach, over the tiny life growing there. Ready to do it all again? Beatrice thought about the sleepless nights and the chaos and the beautiful, exhausting reality of adding another child to their family. Thought about the bakery expansion and the nonprofit's growth, and all the ways their lives would continue to evolve and change. Thought about the million small fears and challenges and uncertainties that lay ahead. "I'm not sure I'm brave enough," she said with a smile, the phrase that had become their private joke, their shared history, the foundation of everything they'd built together. Owen turned her in his arms, his amber eyes warm with love and promise and absolute certainty. "Good thing I'm brave enough for both of us." And as he kissed her under a sky full of stars, Beatrice realized that bravery wasn't something you achieved once and kept forever. It was something you practiced daily, in big gestures and small moments, in leaps across fire escapes and quiet decisions to try again. It was something you could share and borrow and build together with someone who loved you enough to carry your fear until you were strong enough to set it down. She'd spent so long being afraid, and now she spent her days being brave. Not fearless, never fearless, but willing to face the fear and move forward anyway. To take risks and embrace uncertainty and trust that whatever came, they'd handle it together, because Owen had been right all along. He was brave enough for both of them. And gradually, through his love and support and unwavering belief, Beatrice had discovered she was brave enough too, not in spite of her fear, but because of it. Because true courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Years from now, when their children were grown and Calloway's confections had locations across the country, and they were gray-haired and settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage, Beatrice knew they'd still tell the story of how they met. About a kitten and a fire escape, and a man who promised to be brave enough for both of them. About a woman who learned that the biggest risk wasn't in trying and failing, but in never trying at all. And every time they told it, Beatrice would remember that moment on the fire escape, staring across an impossible gap, hearing Owen's voice cutting through her fear. "Be brave with me," he'd said, and she had been. And it had changed everything. Some love stories started with love at first sight. Some started with grand gestures or chance meetings or years of friendship building into something more. Theirs had started with fear conquered and faith offered, and the recognition that the bravest thing either of them had ever done was trust in each other. And that, Beatrice thought as she fell asleep in Owen's arms in the house that was finally, fully a home, was a pretty good beginning for a happily ever after.